Hi, my name is Talia. Welcome to Talia Nerds Out. I was going to try to do a booktube on some fictional books this time because I've done quite a few Historathon booktubes lately. However, I ended up finishing, since last booktube, The Murder of Tutankhamun by Bob Breer. I'm going to say Breer. Bob Breer. I've had this book on my bookshelf for years, but it has taken me till this year to get it started again and finished. So, gosh, I want to say it's been on my bookshelf close to 10 years. So I'm really glad to have read this. I have found it a very enjoyable read. He has an approachable style, not necessarily, well, it can feel a little bit conversational. It sounds like he talks on his lectures. I don't mind it though, because I remember enjoying his lecture series with the great courses. And it was, I think it was just Ancient Egypt. I can't remember the name of the course. Regardless, I got this book because of his lecture series. Someone else was mentioning on the Discord for the Historathon that he also had like a show, maybe a couple shows. So I did find some other material for him just by searching his name on YouTube, if anyone happens to be interested in hearing him speak versus reading this. But I do recommend reading this as well. Speaking of the Historathon, in the description box below, I do have information on the Historathon, including tags for the people who are leading the Historathon. I'll try to remember to tag other people who I watch, who I know are taking part in it. I need to watch more of the videos. I've just had a lot of sensory overload lately, and it's been hard enough to get the reading in. So once I feel like I can watch videos, I will try to do that as well, because, I want to keep up with everyone else as well. So I just didn't want to do this video just to say, hey, I finished this and I'm starting new books, although I am going to show the new books I'm going to be starting to replace this. Yes, books singular. Books plural to replace books singular. But the reason I'm making this video is the thesis of this book that Bob Breer went at this topic with the idea that Tutankhamun was murdered. And he goes through all his evidence, and then he presents his case about who he believes murdered King Tut. Now, I took my own notes, and I've actually built my own theory. In some areas, I agree with him, in others, I don't. Now, from here onward, I have a couple of warnings for everything after this point. Warning 1, if you don't want parts of his theory ruined before reading the book, you might want to stop here, as you probably will want to stop here. 2, if you are someone who doesn't feel comfortable about hearing anything medical, say it makes you anxious or you're grossed out by anything medical, you might want to stop here as well. I do not believe this is particularly gross, but I also have been informed that I don't have a normal person's concept of what gross is. I was a nurse for 10 years or so, and we talk about things that other people would consider not appropriate while we're eating. So I don't necessarily have a great idea of what other people find disgusting. Like I said, I don't believe that there's anything in here that's disgusting, but if you are someone who is easily disturbed by medical things, or find that if you hear medical things, you get medical anxiety and start self-diagnosing yourself, that's repetitive, diagnosing yourself, you probably will want to stop. Okay, warnings completed. Going on from there. And I did take notes because I want to make sure I hit all my points. Yes, I actually have a plan this time. Shockers. I want some of my tea. Irish breakfast in the middle, well, not the middle of the night, but like 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. Fatigued this morning, so this is still my breakfast tea. Okay. So starting off with some of the evidence that the Dr. Breer, I keep saying it different ways. If I say Breer or Breyer, it's the same man. Okay. That Dr. Breer puts forth start from the beginning. I lost my train of thought. I'm going to start with Dr. Breer's theory about who was involved in this murder as he sees it, and the evidence that he puts forth to support that theory. So at the end of the book, Dr. Breer states that he believes that the vizier, and I don't know if that's how it's pronounced, but it's spelled A-Y-E. A-Y-E? I think it's A-Y-E. That he is the vizier. He believes that is the man who murdered Tutankhamun. And his theory is it looks like there was a blow in the back of the head, not because of the bone fragment that was found on X-ray, that was determined to be a post-mortem injury, either caused by the embalmers or caused by his mummy being found and damage caused by that. But there's evidence of a hematoma and staining on the back of the skull, like around C1, C2 area. So there's evidence of staining there that would most likely be caused by a hematoma. So his theory is that there was a blow on the back of the head, but that it was back here, and because of where it's at, it's not quite a normal area that you'd expect to be hit when you fall. I mean, there are circumstances, there are freak falls, but his theory is that King Tut was most likely asleep, maybe on his stomach, and then he got hit over the back of the head, right back here, and then he died of the hematoma from it growing and pressure being placed on the brain. So that was his theory about the cause of death. As for who caused the death, his theory is that the vizier, I'm going to say, A sounds weird, but anyway, A is most likely, he believes, the one who caused this. And he does have some good points. A had motive, means, and opportunity. If you look at motive, A, after Tutankhamun died, not only is there evidence that he became the next pharaoh, there is also evidence that he married Tutankhamun's widow, probably to cement his claim to the pharaohship after King Tut died. So that is his motive, if you do believe that he is the one who, if you do believe that he caused Tutankhamun's death. Then, as for means, he had access to King Tut, access where no one else would have. And actually, this falls under means and opportunity, because both his means and opportunity come from the same place. He was the vizier. He was the next most powerful person in Egypt. The only other person more powerful than him would be the pharaoh. And since King Tut was only 19 at the time, he really hadn't come into his own in his power yet. He probably was just starting to feel for his own sense of how he wanted to rule. And prior to that, he was a child king, and A was pretty much able to run things as he saw fit. So his opportunity for having special access and his means were all wrapped up in his vizier role. On a tomb from a previous vizier, there is an inscription that states that no man has access to the pharaoh if the vizier does not permit it. Everyone has to go through the vizier. So for an assassin to sneak in and get to Tutankhamun would have been very hard without A, being aware of it, or complicit in it. So even if he was not the one to strike the blow, he could have very easily have allowed for someone to come in and he had access where no one else did, even if he was to be the one who did it. So he kind of covers, you can see where he had the motive, the means, the opportunity, where other people might not. So that covers like why he thought A did it and why he thinks that King Tut was murdered. The next part of his theory, because it's a 3-part theory, he says that he calls the book The Murder of Tutankhamun, but he also promotes 2 other possible ideas, and he lays this all at A's feet. The murder of Tutankhamun, the possible murder of Anaxamun, the widow of Tutankhamun. Oh, and prior to that, the murder of a Hittite prince. So there is a mention that after Tutankhamun died, an unprecedented letter goes out to the Hittites from who they believe is Anaxamun, who is the widow of Tutankhamun. She also was a child she was his sister, half-sister most likely, and she was a child queen to his child Pharaoh. So she sends this letter to the Hittites, who are sworn enemies of the Egyptians. So this is completely unprecedented, to the point that the Hittites don't quite believe this is real. They believe this might be a trap. And she's saying, you have plentiful sons. Could you please send me one for me to wed? I want to marry a prince. I do not want to marry a servant of mine. And there is no one here who is worthy of marrying a queen. I would have to marry a servant of mine, and I do not want to do this. And she ends this first letter with, I am afraid. And she sends several letters that are like, look, no, I'm serious. Why did you not believe me the first time? Please send someone. And finally, they are able to convince someone. She's able to convince someone with help of, I guess, a trusted servant a trusted servant is sent by her, and this servant is able to convince the Hittite king that this is in fact a real letter, a real plea. So he chooses one of his sons, and he sends his Hittite prince off to marry Anaxamun. And then there's, because the Hittites kept track of everything, we do have some record of at least them recording this communication back and forth and what they thought about it. News comes back, and this Hittite prince never makes it to Anaxamun. He's murdered at Egypt's border. And at least that's what the Hittites believe. They believe that he was murdered. The next thing we know about Anaxamun is later on a ring is found with her symbol, I guess cartouche, and A's symbol, which is usually something that shows that they were married. So it does appear that she ended up marrying a servant of hers, a highly placed servant, but a servant of hers, against what she had stated she wanted. So that does show something a bit nefarious on that end of things. After that, she just disappears. Nothing else is really heard about her. There are no images with her after that point. It's like she is gone. So there is a theory that perhaps she was murdered. And why does he say that she just disappeared? Well, other than this ring, she doesn't appear either on King Tut's tomb or on A's tomb. And her tomb has never been found. If she ever was buried with the honors that she deserved as royalty. I'm cold. Let me get my shawl. So normally what would happen is if a king was to go to the afterlife, he would be shown on the walls of his tomb, where it would inside the tomb it would show images of what he wanted in the afterlife with him. So there would usually be his wife. There would probably be his children. You might see him playing dice. You might see him hunting. You would see gathered around the tomb the things that he enjoyed using during his lifetime, because they believed that what was seen was what was represented on the tomb would be what the afterlife would look like. That's why if you scratched someone's face out and removed all their images, removed all trace of their name, it was basically trying to make it so they couldn't cross over to the afterlife. Essentially, damning them. So he does not have her image on there, and everything else has shown that, I guess, there's imagery of them in other places, and I don't know I can't remember where they said these other places were, where there is actually some imagery of them. Shows them doing things together, hunting, just spending time together. And it seemed like they were very close. Because and the other thing is he never took another wife, which is fairly unusual. Pharaohs tended to take multiple wives, not lives, although I guess they could have done that too. Now, the thought process could be, well, A just didn't want her on King Tut's wall because he needed her in his tomb to spend the afterlife with him. You go to A's tomb, she's not there either. Instead, you have an image of his wife, who he had before her, and her name was, Tay, or I would say it's Tay, T-E-Y. Instead, you have her image, and she is represented as first wife. Now, she could not be represented as first wife if an Moon was there, because the Moon's royal blood would by necessity elevate her to first wife, especially since his claim would be through her, since he was a commoner. So again, the question is, where is Moon? And why doesn't she not have a representation in two of these places where she should at least be in one of them? And King Tut is represented in a point in A's tomb, and A is also in Tut's tomb, but she's in neither. So there's some question about, okay, what happened to her? It seems like it might be something nefarious. And his theory is that she could have possibly been murdered. And of course, I mentioned the Hittite theory. So those are his theories, and he tries to provide an argument that would put maybe the general, who became the next pharaoh after A, maybe, him is responsible. But at the end, he still comes to his original conclusions that he believes that A was at least involved in the murders of King Tut and the Hittite, and that there's not enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Moon was indeed murdered, because no body was ever found, no tomb was ever found, she just sort of disappears. So, not even circumstantial evidence, just nothing to really conclusively point in one way or another. So those are his theories. My theories are a bit different. So first of all, my theories, especially for King Tut, tend to be based more in a medical area. I'm going to start with, first of all, should I go in order? Yeah, I'll go in order. So the first one to die is King Tut. He's 19 years old, presumably in decent health. A few things are known or presumed about his family background. He is the son, or at least he is the son, one way or another, of Akhenaten. He's believed to be his son. And Akhenaten was believed to possibly have something called Marfan syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder that can cause just instabilities in multiple different areas in, and this could play into things as I'll go into later. One of the things that help people determine or build this theory is that one of the hallmarks of having Marfan syndrome is, besides the arachnodactyly, which is spidery fingers, and overly long limbs, a bit of a willowy stature. And these are all things that you would see in, I'm trying to bring up some images of Akhenaten. I remember reading that it's also like some issues with the hips as well, because they always mention about how there's this really weird shape with the way Akhenaten is shown. I'm trying to find a picture of him in particular. It's a little bit hard because a lot of his images were scratched out. I mean, you can see, the long facial structure, as shown here, the long, thin facial structure with the long, with the thin nose. That's a Marfan characteristic. I know that there are somewhere, and I know I've seen them, but I don't see them here, where there are images with him with his family, where you do see some of the other, manifestations, but most of the pictures showed here are focused on others and not him. But, so he had these characteristics, and I believe that there are some pictures that hint that he might have like some scoliosis, which you can see with Marfan syndrome as well. The other thing, which points more towards, beginning to point towards what I'm talking about, and to possibly show that this passed on to King Tut, is there is a malformation in the skull, which is an elongated head, which you do see at times in Marfans. And this is King Tut's skull, which you can see is abnormally shaped. It's elongated. So it does point to a possibility that we are looking at a passed on Marfan syndrome. So how is this important in talking about the possible murder of Tutankhamun? Well, here's my theory. My theory is that there wasn't a murder. Yes, there could have possibly been an accident. I mean, I guess, but like Dr. Breer says, that's kind of an odd place for an accidental hit to occur. I mean, he did like to hunt on cherries. I guess he could have slipped weirdly and hit his head in the back there, but it just seems a bit odd. And they really didn't go fast enough, I think, to cause much of a whiplash situation. So my personal theory is this has more to do with the connective tissue disorder of Marfan syndrome. Why do I say that? Okay, this is going to go into a bit of what my personal story does have a bearing in this. Okay, I don't have Marfan syndrome, but I have something that is also connective tissue disorder that shares some similar characteristics. My medical condition is Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Now, what are some of the characteristics that it shares with Marfan syndrome, at least as is applicable in this situation? Well, one of the characteristics that is similar with Marfan syndrome and Ehlers-Danlos, and there's multiple characteristics that can be shared, that are shared or could be shared between the two connective tissue disorders. But one of them is that there can be spinal instability and also blood vessels that could be a little bit more prone to tearing or rupture. Now, personal story time. Early on in my discovering that I had Ehlers-Danlos, I was found to have a C1, C2 instability. It was causing enough pressure on the blood flow, on the blood vessels providing blood flow to my brain, that if I had not had other blood flow coming from my carotid arteries, I could have stroked. So that's with it's called subluxation of the C1. It's called lantaxial instability. That's the fancy name for it. Just think of, it's unstable. It's, moving back and forth in a way it shouldn't, blocking off blood flow. So what does this have to do with King Tut? Well, King Tut, say he has this instability, which is a potential with him having Marfan syndrome. What's also potential is that he could have delicate blood vessels there. Say he developed an issue, and it can happen. You don't have to have an injury in the connective tissue with a connective tissue disorder to develop this. I did not hit my head. I did not jerk my head weirdly to cause this instability. I just naturally have instabilities. And he could have possibly just naturally had instabilities. As his connective tissues don't really exist anymore, you can't tell. It's been too long. But, sorry. So if he had an instability there, it could be that it went beyond just blocking blood flow a little bit and causing pre-syncope or near fainting. He could have gotten to the point where it caused a dissection of his cervical artery. And potentially it could have, maybe it didn't dissect it completely. Maybe it just caused a little bit of a leak. This leak, especially without the potential of MRIs or any other imagery at that time, he could have been developing a leak for years. He might have had headaches, particularly back here. He might have developed other neurological symptoms, including some of the ones that I personally developed. But without any ability to do imagery, he probably just kept on keeping on. But as he was living his life, he could have been developing the hematoma that Dr. Breer was talking about. And Dr. Breer mentioned that this hematoma, he believed it to be caused by a blow that could have potentially caused a slow hematoma to develop and cause a slow death, eventually caused by enough pressure on the brain. Well, part of the theory could still be true. He still could have had a slow build to hematoma that caused enough pressure on the brain that eventually he did expire. But perhaps this wasn't due to a blow. Perhaps this was due to a dissection of the cervical artery related to an instability in the cervical spine, which would be not impossible with a diagnosis of Marfan syndrome, in which case you might not be looking at a murder at all. And that is my personal theory, is we're not looking at a murder. We're looking at a young man who had a hereditary connective tissue disorder that, due to medical knowledge and medical resources, at that time, there were no resources or tools available to make it so he would live past the age of 19 if he had run into an issue where he did have a cervical artery dissection. But then I can hear then after saying, okay, well, he wasn't murdered. Well, then why did A jump right on it and become Pharaoh? I have a theory about that, too. I don't think that A was a murderer, at least in the case of Tut, but I do think he was an opportunist. I think that he had been building this dynasty up after having everything torn down, after Akhenaten had moved everything away from the old religion, moved everything away from, I think it was Thebes versus Memphis. I think it is Thebes. Anyway, after he moved everything to Amarna, after Tutankhamun came to power, moved everything back to the old ways. Old capital, old religion, old everything. So I could see when King Tut dies prematurely of unspecified causes, is like, oh darn, I was not prepared for this. He has no heirs, because even though King Tut and Aksumun were young, she had conceived twice, both of them had died while still fetuses. And both of them were mummified, but they would not have been viable. So there were no heirs. All you had was an Aksumun and no one to take over after Tut. So in his head, I think A was going, oh darn, we are headed for a succession crisis. Who's going to take over? You know what? I'm next most important person here. I've been running this Egypt anyway because, this kid hasn't been old enough to do it. I'd make a great pharaoh. So he goes and he's like, well, I don't have a, claim in it of myself. I'm only a commoner. But you know what? He has this hot young widow. I guess I'll marry her. So he goes, he marries an Aksumun, and we have evidence of that. And he takes his opportunity that is offered to him, even though he didn't engineer it. And that's why I do believe it happened, because you could have had some pushback, and this is what Bob Breer's theory was that maybe King Tut was stretching his wings and he wanted to rule on his own, and maybe A was feeling like he was losing control. And that could be. But personally, I think it's more likely that he died naturally, and A took his opportunity, took an Aksumun as a wife because she could bolster his claim to the throne, and he also had himself painted on King Tut's tomb as being a part of helping him along to his journey, like performing the proper rites to help him along to his journey to the afterlife. And while he's performing those duties in his priest's attire on this tomb wall, he is wearing a pharaoh's crown. So in another way, trying to show that he has a claim. Look, it's a succession from King Tut to me. This is totally cool, not at all suspicious. Don't look here, guys. So I think so the marriage to an Aksumun and the imagery on King Tut's tomb, I think, were his attempts to take advantage of the opportunity presented to him. Now, next point I do believe would be, okay, so was the Hittite murdered? Yeah, and I do believe that. I think that Dr. Breer presents that theory very clearly. I don't see anything wrong with that. I do believe that this guy was murdered because an Aksumun stepped out of line and tried to solicit a marriage from someone who she believed worthy of her, instead of maybe someone who she suspected of killing her husband. It's not like she would have known about spinal instability. All she would have known is that her husband was alive one day, the next he was dead, under what would have been seen as suspicious circumstances, probably by her. So I'm sure she was keen not to marry a servant of hers, particularly not someone she might have suspected of doing away with her husband. So I do believe that the Hittite was murdered because of her attempt to solicit him in marriage. And he presents the idea that it was a mixture of A and the general Horemheb, who was the next pharaoh after A, that it was a collusion between the two of them to kill the Hittites. And I agree with that. I think that makes sense. But, so no argument on that. I do think that she probably did believe that Tut was murdered and that A had something to do with it, which is why she solicited that marriage. And I'm pretty sure A knew what she thought too, which might be why the last thing might have happened. A Nox and a Moon and her disappearance. There's not a lot of evidence to point to what happened to her, but I am of the opinion that she probably was murdered. Or maybe encouraged to do away with herself. And my reasoning for this is, first of all, she probably did have her suspicions and her statements that she's afraid and that she doesn't want to marry any servant of hers, and the former coming before her statement of being afraid, which kind of makes me think of her marrying a servant of hers is part of why she's afraid. And just how suspicious these circumstances probably would have seemed to her, especially without any medical knowledge that we have today. I do believe that she was quite suspicious of A, and he probably felt it. Plus, he had been married for quite a while to Tay. He'd been married quite a while to her, and it seems like she had been a very important part. She had received honors of her own while they were under Akhenaten's rule, so she was a very important person in her own right. She could never have been first wife as long as the Nox and the Moon was alive, so she might have even been instrumental in saying, hey, I don't want this kid, 19, 20-year-old, however old she was, having precedence over me. I get to be first wife. And because Anaxamun was of royal blood, it could not be that Tay could be first wife unless Anaxamun was gone. And between Tay's probable disgruntlement and Anaxamun's probable unhappiness, well, definite unhappiness and probable suspicion of A regarding the death of Tutankhamun, I think that she was one way or another made to disappear. And I have other reasons behind just her letter to the Hittites and the fact that, she's not, well, first, let me continue onward. She's not on the tombs either of her husband, her first husband, King Tut, or on the tomb of her second husband, A. And there is evidence that she was married to A because of the ring found with both of their cartouches, I believe is what was on the ring. Both of their symbols on there that showed they were married at some point or another, and it would have had to have been after King Tut died. But she does not make an appearance on his tomb either. Only his first wife, Tay, does, and she is shown as first wife, head wife, that kind of thing. Like there is no other wife with precedence over her, which Anaxamun, like I said, would have had if she had been alive. So what are my thoughts about why she would have disappeared? Or what supports my theory besides everything else I stated that she might have been murdered and other possible reasons that she could have been murdered? Well, of course, her not being anywhere on these tombs, her name not appearing in any other places, and there is evidence that Horemheb might have been just scratching out anything that had connection to Akhenaten. That included King Tut's name, that included A's name, probably Anaxamun's name, and he would write his own name over it. Now, he did leave King Tut's tomb alone, and Dr. Brer states, and I agree with him, that he didn't have anything against King Tut. And since King Tut's tomb was hidden enough away, he left him alone. Now, he didn't do the same for A, so there might have been actually quite some disgruntlement there. But he left King Tut's tomb alone. He just didn't want anyone to remember or think about the heretical days, to the point where he actually erased Akhenaten, King Tut, and A's time as pharaoh from official records. It looks like you went from Akhenaten's father directly to Horemheb if you look at official records. the other three pharaohs, it's like they never existed. So it didn't have anything to do with Tut. So that could be part of a reason that Anaxamun's name disappeared, because she too would have been associated with that time period. But that doesn't explain why her tomb wouldn't show up. And I can't imagine Horemheb destroying her tomb the way he defaced A's tomb. And A's tomb wasn't absolutely destroyed so you can't find it anymore. It was just defaced. Her tomb hasn't even been found, so, or doesn't, as far as we know, never existed. At least not in a form that would have been appropriate for someone of her royal status. And Horemheb, I can't see being more vicious towards her than he would have been towards King Tut. So if her tomb had been something that was accessible to him, I don't believe he would have defaced it, nor do I believe he would have destroyed it. So what do I think is being said by this? My theory is that she disappears from records after her death for a very significant reason. I think whether or not Tay had something to do with encouraging her, encouraging the death of Anaxamun, whether she died by poison or however she might have been encouraged to die, if she was in fact murdered or encouraged to commit suicide. I do believe that the reason we don't see her name written anywhere, even inside of any tombs, I mean, I know that it must be written somewhere because we have it, but not written in her husband's tomb, not written in either of her husband's tombs, and not written, and not having her image on either of their tombs. I think part of that reason is they wanted her to disappear. And I'm wondering if there's a very specific reason he wanted her to disappear. I wonder if her death laid heavy on him, and if he feared that when his heart was going to be weighed against a feather by Anubis as he got ready to pass into the afterlife, if having Anaxamun precede him into the afterlife would then weigh his heart down, make it so it was not light enough to pass into the afterlife, causing it instead to be devoured. And I forget what the creature is called that stands by Anubis to devour the heart of those who are unworthy of passing into the afterlife, those who have guilt still on them. But I wonder if he feared that if she passed in the afterlife, she would speak against him. She would be the cause of his demise in the world to come. In which case, he might have wanted to make sure that she had no chance of having a life past the one she lived in that time and place. That when she passed for good. No afterlife, nothing. That her name would be forgotten and her soul would be gone, damned, or just faded into non-existence because no afterlife for her. So I do wonder if that's part of why no tomb with her name on it, no images of her on either husband's tomb, her name not on either of their tombs. Anything with her name or image probably is still around by accident, by happy happenstance. Well, of course, what's amusing, and Bob Breer does point out something to this as well, no one thinks of A or Horemheb anymore in popular imagination. You think of King Tut, and honestly, Anaxamun, its name I think is more well known than either A or Horemheb for average people, at least if you watch the Mummy series that had Brendan Fraser in it. So, yeah, I mean, what do you think? I'm going to just to recap my theory. I don't think King Tut was murdered. I think that he died of natural causes related to Marfan syndrome due to a hematoma caused by spinal instability because of Marfan syndrome. So, natural causes, King Tut. Hittite prince, yeah, totally believe he's murdered. And an Oxana Moon, I think she was murdered. I think that possibly is the only explanation for why she can't be found on either of her husband's tombs. It just doesn't make sense, especially since A did have a chance to finish his tomb. It was not a rush job for him. So she should have appeared somewhere. Or even if she had been added later to King Tut, it would have made more sense if A had gone like, oh man, we didn't have time, but let's go ahead and add her now. Just that way he does get a chance to spend time with her in the afterlife. Didn't happen. So yeah, I think that she was murdered. Okay, so what do you think? Do you think that Bob Breer's right? Do you think I'm right? Do you think neither of us is right? Do you have theories of your own? Do you like certain aspects of some theories, certain aspects of others, or do you have just something completely different? Once again, I do recommend you read The Murder of Tutankhamun. I also suggest, once you get to the point where he is talking about the evidence, which is, almost halfway through the book, that you maybe start taking notes. Was the first half of the book necessary? I do believe so, because it went pretty in depth with things about his father, which kind of laid the groundwork for some of the things later on that are discussed in relation to this case, as well as going into the medical issues that helped me form my theories, as well as the social and dynastic background that I feel like was necessary both for his theory and mine. So I do recommend reading this book. I do recommend reading not just the last half where he goes into the case, but the entire thing, so you get a fuller picture in order to build your own theory and see if you could come up with something that you think is most likely. If you could point to a different perpetrator, or if you believe that nothing happened that was, nefarious at all. Sound it in the comments. Let me know what you think. I know that I owe a bunch of people responses from previous videos. Like I said, I have been kind of out of it the past week or so. We've had weather over here, and I've been having a lot of overstimulation and fatigue. This has been the first time I felt up to doing a video. So I'm going to end here. Hope to put this up before I go to bed, and I will see you next time. God bless. Bye.